Hello, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about Chapter 7, the Vocabulary Acquisition Model, Learning the Spelling and Meanings of Words. To start with, let's look at the prompt for this discussion post. The prompt: textbook chapters often begin with key vocabulary. Would it be helpful to use these words as the basis of vocabulary instruction? Or should you look for additional words that are key to the major concepts being taught? Why or why not? Should students be invited to participate in this word search? Why or why not? Okay, that's up to you to write what you're going to write. Do your research. Make sure you have a variety of sources. I will be double checking to make sure you're not using the same sources over and over again, because that's a weakness. And the only one you can use over and over again is the textbook for this course. Other textbooks, no. Other articles, you can use them once, maybe twice, but I don't expect to see them more than twice except for the textbook. Now, this is a topic very close to me from my experience when I was teaching 5th grade, between the time when I got my doctorate and I lived in Peru and worked for 17 years and then came back to the United States, and I taught 5th grade for 2 years. Now, the students were from very humble backgrounds. Very few of the parents spoke any English. Those who did were probably Native Americans who had lived on the Indian reservation nearby Escondido, California. And those who, with parents, even those who spoke English, the parents who spoke English, they generally had a low level of education. I'm not sure if any of the parents of my students had ever been to college. And I don't think any of them actually owned a home. Most of them were renters. Perhaps all of them were renters in apartments nearby. My 5th graders, even though it was not a bilingual class, they did not have very high vocabulary. And I could pretty much guess, after working with my students for a while, I could guess which words they knew, which vocabulary words they knew, and which words they didn't know. And I tried before every lesson to pick out 5 words that I was going to preview with them and work with them throughout the hour, whatever we were doing, whether it was math or language arts or social studies or science or art or anything else that I was teaching, that I would find 5 vocabulary words for every hour, and I would put them on the board and we'd talk about them and we'd discuss them, not in a systematic way that they're talking about here in this chapter, because I didn't have I didn't have training in that, except I knew a lot about linguistics. I knew a lot about vocabulary just from living and being in school and working in linguistics for 17 years. We would do that and we'd preview them, and I would make sure that these words were reinforced and that they would be part of any assignment that they were going to be doing for me as well, as far in the assessments. And I found that I didn't have to look very far to find 5 words. Now, there were some other words that they probably weren't going to know. I would mention them, I would explain them as we read them or we encountered them, but there were always the 5 that were of special significance that I was going to teach them every time. And so I found that when I came to TAMU many years ago, like almost 20 years ago now, that there were some students who were having trouble with their PPR exam, that's the certification exam, and also the content area exams. And what I found out was that a lot of them had difficulty with vocabulary. Now, sometimes when you're a second language learner, you latch on to one meaning of a word. And in English, oftentimes, words have 3, 4 meanings depending on the context. And the words don't always have the meaning in a certain context for the primary meaning of the word that you might have learned or that students might have learned in their schooling. And that was confusing them. They found it hard to read the chapters, and they found it hard to read the prompts and the answers to the questions, because there would be a word thrown in there and it didn't seem to make sense because they had not learned the multiple meanings of some of the words. And I got to the point where I could almost predict which words in the preparation materials my students would know and my students wouldn't know. And so I would do special activities with them, or I would emphasize them, and I would ask them about this and that and have them use it in a sentence and so forth. And if they still had trouble with their certification exam, even though I helped them with vocabulary, because there's a lot of vocabulary I couldn't help them with, and they were having trouble with reading because they weren't used to reading long texts, because I found that the students that I worked with in Laredo, those who had trouble with their certification exams, oftentimes had most trouble with the longer questions, the ones that were like 3, 4, 5 lines long, the question or the scenario, and then maybe a sentence or two for each possible response. They had trouble with those. And so what I recommended for them is that they would read novels. And I got some Agatha Christie novels, and I told them that if they didn't want to do that, they could do Harry Potter or some kind of other popular novels that they might be interested in, and that they just get used to reading and seeing these vocabulary words and the structure of sentences and narratives and so forth, and that would help them to learn their vocabulary and to make them better students. And so that's going to be similar to how it's going to be with your students. If my own students, my college graduate students, were having these kinds of troubles, I can see that perhaps your students in secondary school, middle school, elementary school might have the same kinds of difficulties. So this chapter is very important, and you might not go and use everything in this chapter, but there are some good ideas. Sometimes I think when they talk too much about the prefixes, suffixes, and roots and so forth, that can be overdone a little bit, that having words in context is the most important, and to use words over and over again and to see them often. And so another point, another little thing that you have to consider is that when you explain something in Spanish to the students, are you cheating them of learning a vocabulary word that might be useful for them? And so you have to make sure that if you are using a Spanish word here and there or Spanish phrase, that you especially work on the vocabulary that you might think that you need to use the Spanish for. Not all students need the Spanish supplemental, but make sure that if you seem tempted to use Spanish for any particular word, that you especially work on that vocabulary or that phrase that the students need to know. And so this might help you to gauge how to work at the level of the students. A big part of this course is differentiated instruction. That means meeting the needs of all students, the English language learners, the special ed kids, those with who might not understand the culture of the school or of the material being talked about, maybe in social studies or in literature, that you have differentiation. So think about these things, integrate them into your instruction as much as possible. Now going on to my notes for the chapter. The vocabulary acquisition model, learning the spelling and meanings of words. Now, the basis of the vocabulary acquisition model, and that means that it's systematic and it's acquired. And I'll talk about that later, about how it's acquired. There's a spelling-meaning connection. Words in English are not always phonetic. There is not phonetic spelling. And sometimes the meaning of the word remains the same according to the spelling, but it might be pronounced differently in one tense or another tense, and might be spelled slightly different. But you'll see a lot of roots that mean the same with different suffixes, and how you spell that root or how you spell that prefix or that suffix carries meaning. And so read it talks about that better in the book than I can. But it's important for them to take note of the spellings, because you can have a word pronounced the same, spelled 5 different ways. It can be spelled 5 different ways. It has 5 different meanings, but it's always pronounced the same. And so you have to, in English, the spelling is very important in regards to the meaning. Now, principles underlying the vocabulary acquisition model. the principle of system. It is a system. It's developed over the last couple hundred years, last few hundred years. There's a system of meanings in the way we express ourselves in English, and it's different in American English than it is in British English. When we lived in Peru for about 15 years, our daughter became a voracious reader, and she read everything in the library. But at some point, she started in with Nancy Drew books, and she read all the Nancy Drew books. The problem was that the Nancy Drew books were written in the 1930s in England, and they have different vocabulary in England for some common items that you might have in your house or in your car, the roads and so forth. And she kept asking us what this would mean, and we would have no idea because it was the British, and then she'd have to look it up. And she has a great vocabulary because she was learning British vocabulary as well as English vocabulary. There's a system of meaning and words. And even the spelling is different between England and the United States. The spelling is different in many words between American English and Canadian English. And I oftentimes make fun of my students in a joking way, telling them that they didn't spell it American style, that they spelled it British style or Canadian style. And so, for instance, judgment in American only has one E, M-E-N-T. That's the only E in judgment. But in Canada, they also have it after the G. And so, and they seem to like to spell it that way in Laredo. And sometimes in Laredo, people will spell Canadian style some words that you would not be able to publish in America because it doesn't have American spelling. Okay, so the principles of incidence. Also, they talk about how words have to be used in context, must be read in context, must be heard in context several times before you start acquiring or learning it through its usage. And the more you use that word, also the better you will understand it as well, and you will know that vocabulary word. And so you should make sure that if you start saying a word 3, 4, 5 times, or if you see it in the textbook several times and you have no idea what it means, it's time to look it up and trying to find out why that's in there and what it means. And then you have the principle of conceptualization, and words are somewhat arbitrary in that words are constructed. Sometimes they're constructed from something familiar, sometimes it's because they've come from the German or the French or from some other language, but there's a conceptualization in every vocabulary word, and there's some meaning to it, either visual, concrete, or abstract. There's always some kind of conceptualization there. And to refine those concepts, remember we had the concept development model, it's very much that way for vocabulary. Now, how vocabulary is acquired. Acquired is different from learned. In language, as I say, second language acquisition, acquiring a language, that's a lot different than second language learning. Sometimes I learn language by learning through a book and practice and memorization, but I really learn how to speak it and to write it through acquisition by listening to it and using it in conversation and trying to use it in my writing, not just memorized, but acquired. Acquired is what we do when we're children, because when you're a baby, you don't read, you don't write, you don't put your face in a book. You just hear people using language, and you try using language, you make some mistakes, but eventually you approximate the model that was presented by your parents and other adults and children around you, and you acquired your vocabulary in a natural way, instead of learn, which is lists of memory words, things to memorize and looking up in dictionaries and so forth. That's never as productive as acquiring language, and you need to practice. You need to see it used in one context, maybe another context. And like I said, try to acquire seeing a word in different contexts with different meanings, slightly different meanings, through listening and through reading. And so the more you read, especially novels, not just information books, you have a better vocabulary and you'll become a better student through reading. So the steps in the vocabulary acquisition model that's presented in the textbook: pre-test knowledge of words critical to the content. And like I said, whenever I taught something, I would ask my students, I would come up with about 6, 7, 8 words, and I would ask them, okay, what's this? And I would get a sense from my 32 fifth grade students if they knew that word or not. And so I would spend, maybe the first 4 or 5 minutes of every hour talking about words. And I would get a sense of what they knew and what they didn't know. And I was getting pretty good after a couple of years to know what they knew and what they didn't know. If they didn't know it last year, this year's fifth graders probably didn't know it either. And I find out the same thing with my undergraduates in my class, that if my undergraduates last semester didn't know this particular word that well, then my undergraduates this semester probably didn't know those words that well. Okay, then elaborate and discuss spellings and meanings. Talk about the way it's spelled and the meanings, that it can mean several different things perhaps, and take note of spellings and pronunciations, and especially if the word is related to other words as far as spellings and meanings go. And then directly teach words on which comprehension will hinge. If they need this word to comprehend the lesson, directly teach that. And then you read and you study, you're seeing it, you're using it, and then evaluate and post-test. That might just be a very small part of the lesson, but I don't know how valuable it would be to have a whole lesson just on vocabulary. Now, once in a while, especially in language arts, that might be good, but you can integrate this into almost any other lesson that you would have, especially if you're using direct instruction. And you might not even need to put it in there as the objective, but you might put it in your differentiation, that you're going to make sure that in part of your differentiation that you're going to make sure that you're using this method in order to teach these words. Now, evaluating learning in the vocabulary acquisition model, you have to, you'll see how they're responding orally. You see when they're writing, hopefully they're using it. I don't think it's so necessary to use true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank so much. It's going to be more of a formative assessment more than a summative assessment in your vocabulary acquisition model. And if your formative assessment of vocabulary development or learning the words, if it's not working out, you might have to do some reteaching in future days or weeks or even months. Keep going back, and you see that your students really weren't sure about these concepts and these vocabulary words. You might have to go through that again. So I know it's a little bit longer than most of them, but this is really important to me. And so if you have any questions, please give me a call.